Under the hum of helicopters and the flashing of cameras, the mansion in Miami no longer looked like a monument to power. It looked like a fortress under siege. The air hung thick with tension, the kind that hums before the fall. Agents in dark jackets crossed the marble floors that had once hosted the biggest names in music, their boots echoing like a slow drumbeat of reckoning. The man who had built an empire from rhythm and rebellion stood behind them, silent, watching the world he had created collapse piece by piece. For years, he had been untouchable. Sean Diddy Combs, the mogul, the kingmaker, the man who turned parties into kingdoms and contracts into weapons. He knew everyone, owned everything, and controlled what couldn't be bought. Fame had been his shield, money his sword. People whispered about his secrets, but nobody ever dared to shout, until one woman did. Her voice broke through the noise like a cracked bell in a cathedral. What began as an accusation became an avalanche. One lawsuit turned into many. Each name carried a story of nights blurred by drugs, control, and fear. The industry that once worshipped him now shifted its gaze, pretending it hadn't seen what it had celebrated for decades. And beneath all the glamour, the truth was crawling out, raw, unstoppable. The cameras loved him once. Now they devoured him. Every frame caught a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not arrogance, not performance, but fear. The kind that lives in the eyes of a man, realizing the world has turned against him. Behind every allegation was a face. Behind every story, a life he had dismissed as forgettable. Now, those forgotten lives were writing his ending. The courtroom became a theater of irony. The same stage lights that had once crowned him now illuminated his shame. He entered each morning through a metal detector, flanked by lawyers instead of bodyguards. The man who had defined confidence now moved like a ghost through the corridors of justice, wearing tailored suits that couldn't hide the weight pressing down on him. The victims sat across from him, their faces calm but heavy with memory. Each word they spoke tightened the noose around his legacy. They told of promises turned to threats, of trust turned to fear. Some cried. Others stared straight ahead, voices steady, unshaken. Each testimony tore away another layer of myth until nothing remained but the man beneath, stripped of music, money, and myth. The world watched. Commentators argued. Fans denied. Critics gloated. But inside that courtroom, there were no headlines, no hashtags, just the sound of truth, slow and relentless. The defense tried to drown it in paperwork and polished words, painting him as a victim of envy, as a misunderstood genius. But the evidence spoke louder. It was in the ledgers, in the photographs, in the flight manifests, in the quiet terror of those who had lived inside his empire. Day by day, the illusion disintegrated. The empire that once moved mountains began to crumble under the simplest thing of all, honesty. When the verdict finally came, the room held its breath. The judge's words fell like thunder. Guilty, on multiple counts. The man who had once boasted that no one could touch him was now bound by the one thing he could never control: consequence. Outside, reporters shouted his name, but he didn't look up. He sat still, hands folded, eyes hollow. The cameras zoomed in, desperate to catch emotion, but all they found was silence. A silence heavier than words, the silence of a man who had finally run out of power. The echo of it would linger long after he was gone. For the survivors, justice wasn't triumph. It was release. They gathered quietly, away from the noise, their faces reflecting years of buried pain. Some smiled through tears. Others simply breathed for the first time without fear. Their strength had outlasted his wealth. Their truth had outlived his empire. The streets outside filled with chatter, opinion, spectacle. But beneath it all, something deeper pulsed. It wasn't about fame anymore. It was about accountability. About how the world lets power grow until it consumes everything around it. Until someone finally dares to say enough. As the years passed, the story became a cautionary tale. The name that once symbolized invincibility now stood as a warning. Documentaries dissected the fall. Podcasts replayed the timeline. And analysts debated whether the signs had always been there. They were. People just didn't want to see them. In his cell, he had nothing left to sell, no audience to impress. The quiet was foreign, unbearable. For the first time in decades, there was no one to command, no one to charm. Just the echo of everything he had done and everyone he had hurt. His reflection stared back from the metal sink. Older, smaller, emptied of everything that once made him a god in his own eyes. Outside those walls, life moved on. The victims rebuilt. The industry tried to cleanse itself, as if one trial could wash away decades of complicity. But some wounds don't fade. They stay as reminders. Not of what happened, but of how easily it was allowed to happen. The truth about power is that it never disappears. It only changes hands. And in the end, the ones who rise from the ashes aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the ones who refuse to stay silent, no matter how long it takes. Justice, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was simple. The steady voice of a judge, the rustle of papers, the clink of cuffs. But in that simplicity lay something profound, the sound of balance returning, the sound of truth reclaiming space. And in that moment, the world remembered what it had forgotten, that no empire, no matter how loud or bright, can drown out the truth forever.